was an apostle, a genuine first century bigwig. But that's not the way he came to the Corinthians. He didn't expect the red carpet to be rolled out in front of him. In fact, in chapter 2, verses 1 to 5, we don't have to turn there, but he speaks of coming to them in the most simple of ways. He didn't want to be regarded. He wanted the message about his Lord to be regarded. So Paul says he became a servant, and that's a highly instructive word in the New Testament. He became a bondservant, a doulos. An Israelite in the Old Testament economy had the opportunity, if he became destitute, to join himself to a man and become his servant, his slave. After a period of time, the law prescribed that he could go free. But sometimes a man enjoyed the kind of care from his master that was unspeakably kind and merciful. And in some occasions, that prompted that man to choose to remain a servant, a perpetual servant of that man forever, or as long as he lived. So the law prescribed that he could go down to the temple, and the priest would take an awl and pierce his ear, and in which would be placed a ring that would identify him as a doulos, as a bondservant. The kind of servant has chosen to be a servant, a remaining servant. So Paul has given us a principle here about how he was able to win some. He chose to become the servant of Jesus Christ to these people. He didn't ask them for a thing. He became the servant of all men that he might win some. Could Paul possibly be communicating here a fundamental principle of evangelism to us? That others come first. Others come first. Maybe we should learn from that kind of an approach. That others come first. William Booth was the founder of the Salvation Army. Some of you may have heard this illustration about him. He served for many years in an exemplary way in the Salvation Army. The occasion came every year in which he would speak at a banquet, that he would give the vision for the Salvation Army for another year. But on this one occasion late in his life, and he was a very sick man, an elderly man, he said, well, he wouldn't be able to be at the banquet that year, but would send a written message that would be the guiding principle for the Salvation Army in the next year. And on that night at the prescribed time, the speaker walked to the podium and he opened the letter from William Booth, and the letter was one word. Others. Others. The gospel is not the kind of message we keep for ourselves. It's the power of God unto salvation to all who will believe, to the Jew first, but also to the Greek. It's the power of God. It's the kind of power that everywhere that message goes, it will lead to the conversion of souls. So we should consider ourselves to be servants. And secondly, we should be sensitive toward those we are trying to win in verses 20 through 22. Paul takes his idea of being a servant here of all men and in rapid-fire succession applies it to three different groups of people: Jews, Gentiles, and the weak. In verse 20, he speaks to the Jews. He says, "To the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews." Now it's obvious from the book of Acts that after Paul's conversion, he remained socially and culturally sensitive to his Jewish countrymen. As I read the book of Acts, I'm reminded on occasion after his conversion, he must have taken a Nazirite vow, because he mentions getting a haircut. And he mentions wanting to be in Jerusalem by the time Pentecost came. And remember, in Acts 16, he takes Timothy and circumcises Timothy, because Timothy's father was a Greek, and Paul, even after the church council of Acts 15, circumcises Timothy so as not to create any kind of stumbling block for the Jews. So he remained very sensitive to the manner in which the gospel would go to the Jews. I wonder for us in this room tonight, would we even know how to sensitively evangelize Jews? After all, the gospel should go to the Jew first, and then to the Gentiles. So he talks about being sensitive to his own countrymen, the Jews. And then secondly, he talks about those without the law in verse 21. And I think what he's getting at here, which is a little complicated, but anyway, he's talking about toward the Gentiles. Paul certainly did not mean that he would intentionally violate God's law so as to be right at home with them. He's not talking about going out and living a sinful kind of life, that he would willfully violate God's moral order. But you know, the Corinthians, as I said a while ago, were very well known for their lawlessness. Their lasciviousness was known all across the ancient Near East. So great of a sinner were they that there was actually a verb that was used to describe it, Corinthiazomai, to act like a Corinthian. These he considered to be under the law of Christ. He is saying to those who are Gentiles, he's going to act toward them like Jesus Christ. I wonder, how much of Jesus Christ do our families, friends, and neighbors see in us? How much of Him is really evident to those around us? Are we those that can clearly be identified unmistakably as being God's people? And imagine that we should act toward others like Him. Our behavior is important. What does that mean day to day for you and I? Well, it can mean all kind of things. You know, it can mean that maybe as I look across the street and see maybe some neighbor of mine that may not be a Christian struggling with something that he's trying to lift, I might run across the street and say, "Let me help you with that, my friend." I might do some act of service. I might, minister to some lost family in death or something like that. There's any number of ways, and any number of books on evangelism will give you more ideas than you can put into practice about how to be a Christian to an unbeliever. It is something that they take note of. For after all, Jesus did say to His disciples, "By this will all men know that you are my disciples, if you have love one for another." Maybe, like Paul, we would win some if they saw more of Jesus Christ in us. And thirdly, Paul says to the weak, or he says of the weak, Paul was willing to make the gospel clear to the lowest level of comprehension. Paul came to Corinth, as I said earlier when I was referring to chapter 2, in the simplest, most foundational, rudimentary terms. He came to Corinth in simplicity, so that anyone who saw him, anyone who listened to him, could understand him as being a Christian. My friend, that's total transparency. How many of our lost friends know us that well? Maybe I was presumptuous there. Do we even have lost friends? Do we have? I hope we do. Because if we as the light never touch the darkness is forever going to be unchanged. We've got to get over that idea of keeping ourselves associated together as some kind of holy huddle. We want to be open and transparent to those around us. It seems like the day in which we live, someone's being exposed in one way or another for about everything. So much so that sometimes Christians can't be identified as being all that different from lost people. So in conclusion tonight, I ask the question, why aren't we more evangelistic? And I'm not asking that of you without facing the reality of that question for myself. Are we afraid to be thought of as stupid or unenlightened? Have we been intimidated by the culture we live in so that we have somehow come to doubt that the gospel is truly the power of God unto salvation? I would hope not. And I have some applications that I think I would use to encourage you tonight to think about in light of what we've talked about in chapel here. And it's first of all this idea. Remember that God may have an assignment for you. God may have an assignment for you daily. Pray for opportunities. Pray for opportunities to share the gospel. You may never know where something like that will go. Pray for opportunities and pray for wisdom, that you would be sensitive in light of those opportunities to be thoughtful and critical about how you might share the gospel in the most effective way with that individual. And secondly, take time to get to know an individual before you share the gospel. Get to know them. I think it's perhaps a little bit presumptuous of us at times to jump the gun and really begin to talk about something that we should regard as sensitive enough that we need to earn the right to talk to someone, a family member, a friend, a neighbor, about that. Take the time to get to know an individual. Practice Matthew chapter 7 and verse 12. As do unto others as you would have them do unto you. I was reading today on a website on evangelism, Larry Moyer's site from Larry Moyer. I don't know if he's still on the faculty at Dallas Seminary or not, but he still is associated with a group called Eventel. He's talking about doing airplane evangelism, being stuck on an airplane with a bunch of people, and the airlines pack them in like sardines, so you're going to sit next to somebody, but if that person is sound asleep sitting next to you, it might not be the most appropriate time to say, hey, wake up, I've got the gospel to share with you.